Good afternoon. Welcome to Cooper Hewitt. Welcome to our Designing an Accessible New York City panel discussion. Thank you. And thank you all for choosing to spend your afternoon or your day with us at Cooper Hewitt. Cooper Hewitt is committed to broadening its audiences and ensuring that the museum is welcoming to all. We're thrilled to be able to use our galleries and our museum resources to raise awareness of accessible design innovation and inspire dialogue. This is a journey, and today's symposium, Cooper Hewitt's 2-week lab design access, and the Access and Ability exhibition on our first floor galleries and online are only part of this movement that will grow and build and leverage Cooper Hewitt's role as a dynamic design hub to promote problem solving and support of inclusivity. Cooper Hewitt's collection was founded by 2 New York sisters, Sarah and Eleanor Hewitt, who ultimately gifted all of the objects to the Smithsonian with the express caveat that it never leave New York City. Our permanent residence, housed in Andrew Carnegie's 1902 home, is our brick and mortar residence in New York City. So designing an accessible New York City is a conversation that resonates not only for us and our visitors and institution, but its 8.53 million residents and its 60.3 million visitors. No pressure. This afternoon's panel is assembled to explore what it means to design an accessible New York City by looking at physical infrastructure, planning accessible systems and tools, and assistive technology. We'll explore how an infrastructure built in the early 1900s can address the diversity of needs that are being asked of these systems, and how might technology bridge those gaps. Let me introduce you to our moderator, Commissioner Victor Calise. Victor is the Commissioner of the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities since 2012. He acts as a liaison between the disabled community and city government and advocates for the passage of legislation to help the disabled community and is the chair of New York City Building Code Accessibility Committee. Victor will throw it out to the panel to introduce themselves. So over to you, Victor.
Thank you, Pam. Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And I do have one house rule: tweet and tweet often. And the reason I say that is not the fact that we just want publicity, but we want publicity about people with disabilities. Anytime there's a conversation of going on about people with disabilities, we've accomplished something. And the more that we're there, and the more that we're loud, and the more that we're proud, the more we're going to make a difference. And we can't do that unless we all do it together. So thank you, and please do tweet as much as you can. It's an honor to be here. My office does a lot of great work for people with disabilities, but I'm especially happy that that we're here today talking about accessibility in our city. I want to recognize Tom Finkelpearl, the Commissioner of the Department of Cultural Affairs. Tom is a tireless advocate for people with disabilities. And when we put out the cultural plan, he ensured me that we would lead with people with disabilities. And he did that, and he did a great job. Thank you, Tom, and thank you for commitment to people with disabilities. Carolyn Bowman, thank you for today. I appreciate everything that you've done in putting this together, and Ruki and Pam for everything that they've done. So I want to kick it over to the panel to introduce themselves, because we got a diverse panel of people that are up here, and I have to admit there's more women than men, so that's a good thing, right? Yep. So I guess we'll start off with Cleo. You want, introduce yourself and a little bit about the work that you do.
Okay. My name is Cleo King. I'm Deputy Commissioner at Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, and I have worked in the field of disability civil rights for 30 years. I was like 2 when I started. And in our office, I've been with the city for 3.5 years, so it was a little different transitioning from nonprofit world to the city. But our agency, we do a lot. We work with the community. We take in issues, complaints, ideas, and we work with the city agencies in trying to help them make their programs and facilities more accessible.
Hi, everybody. I'm Luc Dubois. I'm a professor at New York University. I co-direct something called the Ability Project, which is an interdisciplinary initiative for human-centered design for people with disabilities. We do all sorts of stuff. One of the things we did was we ran a really awesome class in collaboration with the Cooper Hewitt last fall, looking at this space as a site of innovation and accessibility. So I'm excited to be here.
I'm Patricia Moore. I'm an industrial designer, and I'm also a gerontologist. And I've found a path in life of trying to make accessibility, usability for all ages and abilities. And I've never designed for a disability, because why would I? I design for someone's capacity, and my job is to augment it and exceed it, and give people the tools that they need so that they're no longer referred to as someone with a disability.
My name is Alex Elgudin, and I'm actually kind of here in a hybrid role. I'm the president and founder of Wheeling Forward and the Access Project, and the Access Project is a wellness center specifically designed for people with disabilities and was featured in the Cooper Hewitt recent journal, specifically on our design and how we cater to that population. And I also work for the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission as the accessibility manager in helping the city increase accessibility for its taxi fleet. So look forward to this panel.
My name is Elise Roy. I'm a consultant, and I help organizations analyze things from the perspective of people with disabilities. I have 15 plus years of working with the disability community. I used to be a disability rights lawyer in my former life, and now I do inclusive design.
We got them all clustered down here. Hi, my name is Kat Holmes. I'm a designer, engineer, recently founded my own company dedicated to inclusive product design and development, doing that with some of the well-known names of startup and big tech, the Facebooks and the Pinterests and the Microsofts of the world. My focus is on really the starting point for people into the space, coming into the space of really thinking about accessibility and inclusive design, and starting with how we recognize exclusion in our own work, the things that we create, and helping companies really see the spaces that they're creating exclusion across physical, social, cognitive types of interactions that people have with their products.
Hi, my name is Kira Gwynn, and I'm the designer of a sitting aid called Scallop, which features in this exhibition. I work for a company called R82 in Denmark, which is based there, and we specialize in creating products for children with disabilities.
Great. All right. Excellent panel. Thank you. We're going to jump right into this, and I just encourage everyone to just be as honest as you possibly can. Let's try to have some fun up here, and get some laughs in here, and really talk about accessibility. I like having fun at work. I think Cleo can attest to that, right? There's nothing worse than going to work and not having fun. And I just had an espresso, so I'm just like on fire. Cleo knows exactly what I'm talking about. Patricia, you just mentioned something that just hit me right away, that you don't design for people with disabilities, that you just design. Can you talk a little bit about that?
As a child, I was gifted with the vision of watching my grandparents in our home. And when people say, "Why did you become a gerontologist?" and they kind of cringe, it's sadly what we saw with our beloved late Dr. Butler, who tried so hard to get young medical students interested in the field of geriatrics. And they would say, oh, geriatrics, well, they're just going to die. And it's like, yes, as are you, sooner than later, if you keep that up. But I was struck by the fact that I was listening to the adults in the room talk about my grandmother and my grandfather with each passing year as, you know, oh, poor dear, or oh, poor thing, or what they can't do, as if they were being blamed for aging and losing capacity. And the only reason they lost capacity was that there was a misfit with the tools, the environment, the products that they lived with. And I just considered it a great blessing that I realized they were not to blame, they were not at fault. And as my education progressed and as my career started, I fought very hard to establish a new mentality and methodology in design that embraced all people of all levels of ability as equal. And I fought very hard about the language because I found as I met with corporations all over the world, if I was sitting with the board, the president, the CEO, and I started to say, well, why don't we take your product line and make sure we extend it to the needs of people who don't have vision, or people with lack of hearing, or people who ambulate with wheels instead of one foot in front of the other? They would say, oh, we don't design for those people. So my mantra has always been to, first of all, in my head, beat them to a bloody pulp, and then smile and you know, get them past that prejudice to recognize that that's rather stupid not to want the money of all consumers as equal. And so I fought very hard to remind us that none of us is fully abled and none of us is disabled. We all have a capacity, we all have a level of ability. It's forever evolving and changing. A woman in her third trimester has as much trouble getting out of a chair as I do now, recovering from a crushed leg. And I work with so many of our wounded warriors. And when I was struck by a car in New Zealand. And so I was in New Zealand for a few months recovering there, and then when they brought me back to the States and I got to go to the VA again, all the guys in the ward were so happy to see me and so relieved and so delighted that I was walking, and I'm looking at these wonderful kids without limbs and arms, and here they were worried about mom. And so that's why I celebrate the fact that if we can take the focus off of the name calling and the silos and the assumption that we're designing for special interest groups and try and create this umbrella of sensible, reasonable, realistic, good finance, good citizenship, and make consumers able by design, that we do a better job and we don't have to worry about those people.
So inclusive design, it's kind of what everybody, person with a disability, looks for. And we hear about those people, right? And we hear about those people. Those people are all of us. And I'm just trying to figure out, how do people with disabilities get involved in the design process of things? Kat, can you take that?
Sure. Thanks, Victor. Actually, we had a great discussion over lunch, and that question came up as well. When I think about the one place where we can make the biggest difference in this cycle of exclusion in design is by transforming who makes the things that populate our world. And to do so, really changing the profession of design or whatever, engineering, whoever's making these solutions. Changing that profession requires rethinking how our hiring practices work. You know, a lot of, just as an example, tech companies, they have you come in and you're in intense scrutiny for 6 or 7 hours in interviews, one-on-one questioning and precision questioning, and really rethinking how does that really apply to the skills that we're hiring for? If we're thinking about the creative coding skills that someone has, someone who's on the autism spectrum, thinking about that hiring process and how would you need to transform the stages of conversation, the types of problem solving, engagement. Could it happen through an active, tactile exercise as opposed to a verbal Q&A? And so in the companies that I've worked with, thinking about how that process can become a 6-week engagement with mentorship over time to help assess skills that are actually core to the work that needs to be designed and done. And then that being a continuation to a success in the role, which then requires another set of evaluations around how the environment really is supporting the skills that are key to the role, as opposed to someone adapting themselves to the environment, the culture that already exists. So there are substantial transformations that need to happen in how we hire, how we, the tools that are required to practice. And then also in the design process, thinking about building relationships with communities. We've also talked with quite a few people here about the role of human beings, the interdependence between people, and that design, as much as we love objects in design and things that we can hold, the real engagement and the real creativity comes from how people are bringing together their skills. And so whether it's at the beginning or the end or the middle of your design process, my focus is how can we bring in with a substantial contribution in a compensated role with a real design impact with a range of people with disabilities, abilities across the cognitive and physical, wide spectrum. And so creating ways to do that in a way that is equal to the value of that contribution, that a person is compensated in that way as well, is incredibly important.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that a little bit, to bring it a little bit more into the New York City realm. I think Victor has been a great champion in kind of pushing that forward. The MOPD has created the concept of the DSF, which is Disability Service Facilitator, which I am one of at the Tax Limousine Commission, but we have a couple here. Chris Noel at the Parks Department. Jen is here from HRA. I think I saw a couple others in the room. But I think it goes to the point that the city is taking an active role in trying to get people with disabilities into those kind of positions, and then advocating for accessibility. The truth is, I have two roles at the Tax Limousine Commission. One is making sure that office is accessible, which to be honest with you, sometimes is as challenging as making the taxi fleet accessible. And you know, I work in a building. Yeah, Victor said we should be very honest, so I'll be very honest as a city employee.
Uh-oh.
I work in a building that has three...
Be careful of that lawsuit, Alex.
Yes, I know. I work in a building that has 3 government agencies in it, taking up, 20, 30 floors. When I started working there, the front doors did not have a push panel. There were about 4 or 5 doors there. And it was a little bit mind-boggling to me. And I had to pick whether the first thing I was going to fight about whether was going to be a taxi policy or the front door. And I did choose taxi policy. I wanted to get in there and earn my credit a little bit. But ultimately, it is very true. In the workplace and in your specific position, you have to advocate for accessibility. It's becoming much more the norm and accepted that having a person with a disability in such a role is like having a resident advocate. I am often called a resident advocate, and I look at that as a great way to state the role and position that you have. It doesn't, and I think the conversations come a long way, because when I asked for a push panel at the door, not a single person at the agency looked at me funny. Years ago, they probably would have. Now, what if I wasn't a quadriplegic in a wheelchair and I asked for a push panel at that door? Would they have been looked at funny? Probably. I don't think that conversation has gone that far yet, but nonetheless, it is getting there.
So let's talk about that push paddle, right? How many people in this room, I'm just going to ask you, I'm going to take a quick survey, that you look for that curb cut when you're walking down the street? Everybody raise their hand. Just about everyone, right? Universal design. And when you go into Duane Reade's now, what do you see? An automatic door that everyone could walk into. So that universal design is certainly in force. But what are the innovative ways that we are tackling accessible design? Cleo, you want to weigh in on this?
Sure. As you had said, you're chairing the committee on the building code and the accessibility chapter as we amend the code to bring it up to the international code standards. That process is long. It takes a long time. So if you do create something innovative that's going to make, say, the city streets more accessible, and it doesn't fit within that code book, you have to advocate as a designer to get that concept in there somehow so that it does comply with the code. Somebody's not going to cite you for violating the code. Somebody's not going to sue you because you didn't build to the code standards. And a good example that we've
That's that's my counsel speaking, right?
Sorry, have to take that hat off. But we've been working with a company that's trying to take the concept of bus lift and make it for entrances that have a step or two where there isn't enough room to put a ramp, a permanent ramp or a permanent lift on the street, and that it deploys when it needs to and then goes away when it's not needed. But again, it's going to be a challenge to get that approved by the code folks. And so we need advocates, we need designers who are advocates for these types of things so that we can, as we see improvements, we can get them implemented.
Thank you. Eloise, you want to weigh in on this a little bit for accessibility and design?
For the captions to come up.
The technology's not there yet, huh?
So whether technology is there, yeah, of course not. There's such a long way to go. But it's definitely technology is getting better and better. For me, just in the past 5 years or so, it's completely opened up my doors. I now have an app on my phone that captions what is said. I can call people for the first time in my life, pretty much. And that's been amazing, an amazing experience.
What app is that?
InnoCaption. So the FCC approved of it, and it's paid for by the FCC. And basically, when I call somebody up, it just captions what is said. It's extremely helpful.
Thank you for that. I learned something today.
We read these things, and they're so awful. I mean, this is remarkably good. Only caught like one error.
So how's the accuracy on that app?
It all depends. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not. And as a person with a hearing loss, you are kind of always playing catch up in a conversation, whether it's on the phone or trying to read somebody's lips. You're understanding, I mean, it all depends on the person, but from 50% to 75% of what is said, and you're trying to put pieces together like a puzzle.
So people who are deaf and hard of hearing are pushed aside a lot in designing for hearing access. Can you give us some great examples of how we can bridge that gap in hearing access? Because we struggle with our office, and I came here today, was very excited to see ASL and captioning. And often when we put meetings together in my office, we get all this technology in there, but it never runs smoothly. And it's frustrating because it's such a disadvantage for people who are deaf and hard of hearing. Can you give some examples of some ways we could improve that technology?
Improve the technology. Definitely, it starts with voice recognition, improving that. In terms of the city, things like I have problems if there's an ambulance coming. I might not hear it. So maybe having some sort of visual display at lights, flickering lights or something like that. In terms of transportation, I don't know, I haven't been on throughout New York subway system very much, but I have had problems where I've taken a train and somebody comes out and just yells the stop. And I've gotten on the wrong train, and ended up in the wrong place. So making sure that those types of signs are there, pretty basic stuff like that.
So it's increasing technology and also ensuring that people have a good understanding of doing that.
Yeah, and there's also some really cool stuff happening. For example, in Accessible Alley, they're trying to design their first fully accessible self-driving car. And one of my clients there is in charge of putting in the technology which will interpret voice into a sign language avatar and sign language into voice. It's a really cool technology, and if I could have that anywhere, it would be amazing. You know, one of the things that I wish I could do is just be able to strike up a conversation with anybody, you know, a stranger, and I really miss that. And so for that to come into being is extremely exciting.
Yes, working with the deaf and hard of hearing community, we see more and more of this, and it's our commitment to do that within the city and find out new innovative ways to move forward. And I know a lot about Accessible Alley. I was just at the Computer Electronics Show with them, and I've been working closely with them. And we'll talk about Accessible Alley and autonomous vehicles later. So how is this happening in Denmark? So if you can touch base and let us know, Kira, right? Yeah, Kira, if you can, because there's a lot of things that are happening in the U.S. and a lot of people are here from the U.S. What's Denmark? I mean, very progressive country, really socialized medicine, really care about people with disabilities, lots of studies and innovative things that are going on. My wife did a study in Denmark and lived there for a couple of months with spinal cord research, so I know they're on the cutting edge.
Yep.
So give us some insight.
So I don't know how much detail I can go into. I've only been there for 2.5 years. But I think one of the things that struck me most about being there is, I don't know if anyone's been to Denmark or Scandinavia in general, one of their favorite transportations is bicycle. And one of the things I noticed by moving around in the different cities, and especially in larger cities, is the accessibility for bikes, push bikes. If you look at the ramps, traditional ramps for, I guess, wheelchair users, where they're put in places, and throughout Denmark, and I'm sure in other places as well, these ramps are built in to lots of areas for where there's steps or where there's any sort of different levels, and they're there designed from the beginning for push bikes. And now that brings me to understanding now took away these steps. Yes, they're still there as an option, but you put in this ramp, which is built in as the design, as the core, not an afterthought. And now with these ramps, yes, they're designed mainly for push bikes, but then you have mums and dads pushing strollers and pushchairs. Then you've got wheelchairs. Then you've got kids coming down on skateboards, and you've got kids running up and down the ramps. And all of a sudden, it becomes this community of people, and everybody's using what was designed or with the intention of for push bikes. And I think that it's a great way of looking at it in terms of inclusive design is how you can take one element and how that adapts to so many different people and so many different needs. And I think that it's a great example for these ramps. I mean, I'm sure everybody's seen some ugly ramp that's been put on the side of a building as an afterthought. And you just look at it and you go, ugh. Yeah. And all of a sudden when you see these beautiful curvy ramps or paths even, and all of a sudden you look at it with a completely different perspective, and you have children running up and down, and pushchairs, and bikes, and skateboards, and people, and all of a sudden it becomes part of it, and you don't look at it in a certain way. It becomes a part of the environment, and there's positive experience.
So that universal design, more or less, is really building universal design and building for the wheel, which I love for lots of reasons.
Yep.
And it really builds that social integration.
Yeah, of course.
So that social integration is there. Luke, I am going to get to you, I promise, Luke. But we're going to talk about some challenges in design and how people decide that they're going to build this ugly ramp or this inclusive ramp. So build the stairs in front of us, but put this little elevator next to us that gets some access. Let's talk about that design that's not inclusive. Alex, I know that this was something that you wanted to talk a little bit about.
Yeah.
And anyone, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I'll kind of kick it off. I mean, this was a real issue that came up recently. Edith was here, myself, we were at a public forum where there was a structure, specifically an elevator, that was going to be built to create access to a subway in a neighborhood here in the city. And a lot of the local residents or those in the community board brought up this issue that, hey, you're going to be building this accessible thing here, but it's not aesthetically pleasing. It doesn't match our neighborhood. It doesn't really look good. You know what I mean?
They claimed it was under something else, though.
Well, they used two reasons, and the other one was that it was a safety risk, that there was some kind of risk for terrorism. And it's like, at least they didn't say straight up that, we don't really want access. Like, at least it's become not okay to say that.
Okay, so you make it sound bad.
Right. You may, again, I'm getting there. And ultimately from being there and hearing the people speak, what really came out of it was like, hey, we support accessibility, just not here. Make something else accessible. And that's an attitude that does exist. You know what I mean? And it's a real problem. Thankfully there were disability advocates in the room who made everybody turn red in the face when they were talking, and it was great. Ultimately, the committee voted in favor of the access, but this is a real stigma, a real underlying problem that in this case it came out to the forefront, but how many times does it not come out to the forefront?
Yeah, those are real issues, and our design has to be inclusive. Can someone give an example of a Demwork design that's been placed here in the city? Cleo?
The High Line.
Bingo!
Hey, I won $100,000. No, the High Line, they have steps, but in the steps, they made the ramps kind of, I guess, almost perpendicular, so that the steps and the ramps are all one structure, as opposed to, again, you have the steps and then the elevator or the ramp. It's not, you have to go hunting for it. And I think that was great, and I think the reason why was because the Parks Department was really involved in getting the High Line constructed, and we're coming from the point of view of access needs to be included from the beginning, not an afterthought. And I think that is really important, to work with designers, developers, architects, builders, engineers, so that they know that that's important. And it's not this kind of, well, not in my project, oh, I support it, but not in this project because this project's a piece of art and the art's all about stairs, so we can't have access. People need to be educated, and I think a lot of times, before I came to the city, I worked with a lot of architectural firms. Some people got it, some people didn't. A lot of times it was just they were following the minimal code requirements. We have to do this. They didn't understand why they had to do it. And I really think that if people understood what it meant to have a ramp as opposed to stairs, ramps work for everybody, whether you're toting your suitcase to JFK from Midtown, taking the air train, or you're pushing a stroller, or you're pushing your bike on the street.
You want
Luke.
to say something?
Yeah, I'm gonna come. You're up, Luke.
Oh yeah, this is very true. This is an education problem, maybe some of this is an education. I remember reading your story and the story you just said about the elevator, and I remember reading that in the paper and being so troubled by it that I actually kind of like shut it off in my head, and you just reminded me of the story. I was like, oh yeah, I read that. That's completely insane. Yeah, but the education thing, so to your point, so like we teach this stuff, and engineering students and design students are very easily radicalized on this issue in the best possible way. Like if you sort of look around the room, you know, you can get them like woke pretty fast to it, and then you can keep them there if you really focus them on not just the letter of the law, but also the spirit of human-centered design. But you also need it for everybody, right? You need it for the community board members to understand why it is, and you need it for tourists on the High Line to understand what it is, and that, to me, feels like the push, and I think one of the hardest things in this space is that whole like, to your point, I loved your language on how this all puts together, this whole like, you know, who if I'm a designer, who am I designing for, right? And what am I designing towards? And I always think like Ursula Le Guin had this great line when she would give a speech, right? This whole like, you know, I have no right to speak to you. I only have the responsibility you have given me to speak to you, right? And like if you kind of hold that in your head, you're gonna just come up with better stuff. And you're still gonna make mistakes, but you're gonna make less mistakes, right? And you're gonna make more inclusive mistakes. Maybe it's not, yeah.
We're going to hold we're going to get to questions and answers. Don't worry about that. Alex?
I have one. You know, I wanted to just touch on this concept real quick of radicalization or folks being really gung-ho about accessibility. And I really think it's when our able-bodied fellow citizens, you know, find a use or a use is found for them that things really change. And I'm going to bring up a very unique example that happened, that I've seen happen over the last year or two, that I think is phenomenal. So, you know, I worked as an attorney for many years, and I'm still an attorney, not for many, but for several years after college. And I worked in courthouses. And one of the biggest challenges in courthouses was accessible desks and getting desks that are high enough for my wheelchair to come under. And honestly, I worked for a certain judge, and everything's like antiquated, in a good way, like antique in a courtroom. And there was this like really beautiful desk that I worked at, but it was too low. So for a year, I worked as a judicial fellow, and I had to work sideways because I couldn't get underneath it. And that's a bad example. But now I work in a government office where, because we've had an epidemic of back pain, and I've seen this in a lot of offices, you can't find a desk that isn't height adjustable. Every single desk in my specific government office, and I know in many other places now, is height adjustable. I would never have to make a special request or do anything. You just roll up, there's a little switch, you go up as high as you want. I mean, it's also because tons of people are working standing up now. But this is like, I wish I would have made this argument that desks should be height adjustable to save people's back pain, not because my wheelchair needs to fit under it. But it's like this revolution that I've seen that's happened naturally or not naturally, that's like this very unique conjunction of social integration and design and technology. And it's like things like that happen one baby step at a time is how we get to really inclusive workplaces and an inclusive world.
So we're talking about, you know, I heard a lot today about ramps and accessibility, but it's bigger than wheelchairs. And we, people with disabilities, are always fighting the issue of a 1900s infrastructure. Cooper and Hewitt were big advocates for subways, and I just read a book called The Race Underground, and just think about that. If we were able to build elevators, that would be great, and back then, but we didn't have the foresight to think about that. But now we are in a new era, and new infrastructures are being built. But the problem with the new infrastructures that are being built is we have people with disabilities are fighting the old infrastructures, trying to make them accessible. And now new infrastructures are being built, and they quasi have accessibility built into that. So Luke, let's talk about technology and how we can bridge, because I wholeheartedly believe, and I know from the work that we've done in our office, that we can bridge the gap, that we can actually take technology, Kat, and I'm pretty sure you can talk to this, right? Just being with Microsoft a little bit. But we really push Luke off to the side, you know? But Luke, it's your turn, Luke. It's all yours.
No. So it's. I mean, the way I always think of it is it's 2018 and we don't have time for this shit anymore. So we need to fix this. That's how I think of it.
I like that. I got to use that line.
And that's my thought on this. And so a lot of it is just, Yeah, we're making all these new things, but like we actually have technological capacity to fix so much of this stuff already, and it's about a will to make these things. There's also a gatekeeping issue that I see. So it's not that there aren't lots of really excellent and capable, accessible designers out there, or people who understand the precepts of universal design. They're not getting pipelined correctly, and the companies aren't amplifying that work. That's my read on it. There are some groovy things coming online, so things like speech recognition is just getting better and better and better because we have all this cloud stuff and it does smart things and, it's cool, right? And that's all great. So I see a lot of things. The big thing we do at the Ability Project is looking at democratizing technology. I just want everything to be 1/100th of the price and in your pocket instead of being really expensive and, God forbid, in a clinical site, right? Like I want things in your home. I want things in your under your control, under your choice, under your under your agency. That's really how we think of it. Is just stuff is getting cheaper. And that's always good. I'm also looking more and more at these kind of meta things that are sort of in the cracks, right? Like, so if you're a college professor, it's all about knowing more and more about less and less. So like I spend a lot of time with these meta things around things like pediatric assessment, right? Pediatric assessment is ableist, right? Like, do y'all know what the Beery VMI is, right? Like, so like, they give children these tests for cognitive function that presume sensory and motor function to test them. Right, like they'll make you draw stuff on pieces of paper.
Right, you're marked for life. That's my son.
Yeah, and so I have declared war on that whole system, and I'm trying to tear it down, right? Because that's a really terrible, like meta.
So how do we take? Great lead here, but how do we fix that with technology? What do you think some of the gaps are that we can bridge for that specific issue, right? And that label that his son has here.
Victor, every time you have an issue where my friend Fasoon Altaser, and I know you know her, can't get in an elevator because it's not working. What's the protocol? There's no protocol. We need civic protocol, and your phone should light up every time there's an elevator anywhere in New York City, and you should know about it, right? This is the way we got to do this. Like it's got to be civic centered. New York City's got to know there's an elevator. Boom! That's easy technology. It's not about technology. It's about implementation. It's about government. It's about people empowerment. And if I'm at an elevator, fine. I can stumble my way down the stairs. When my friend Fasoon's at an elevator, she calls her. She got to get the person down at the ticket booth who's like inconvenienced in this way, that doesn't want to help her. Then the police come, they don't want to help her. The fire department comes, maybe they'll throw her over their back and they'll throw the chair down the steps, any which way she can to get on that train, to get home, to get to where she needs to get to for that day. This is a real thing. So look, you need to have what's the protocol? Somebody tell me, what's the protocol?
Well, right now we're talking about technology and bridging the gap. We'd be happy to.
It's technology, right? That solves a lot of problems. That's a good thing.
Yeah,
What's the protocol?
Well, let's continue with the conversation with Luke. We'll definitely we'll answer those questions when we get to some questions and answers.
Yeah,
right now. Okay. Go ahead, Luke.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Anthony,
Luke.
You're right. Yeah, no, you should go ahead.
Okay. I want to, actually, sir, I want to speak to your question because it's not a question, it's the reality of the issues of inequity. And I'm a New Yorker, but I don't live here full time anymore. I was here about 6 months after my injury, and when I checked into the hotel, I asked the guy at the front desk, in the event of an emergency, how were they going to get me out of the room? And I've always been mindful of the silly little map on the back of my door and where do I run in the midst of a fire, what do I do? But in this case, I was still using a walker and I wasn't very ambulatory. And he was exceptional, I'll say. He said, I'm on duty all night, Dr. Moore, I promise you I will come and I will carry you out. We won't forget you. Don't you know, we had a fire in the hotel that night. And this man was, banging on the door, used his pass key, scooped me up, brought me down to the lobby, and all I could think of is, what about the others? You know, why is it just about me? What about the person who sleeps, you know, like they're dead to the world? What about? And so the fact that we have inequity and the fact that we've been arguing that technology is going to fix all things, I think is the problem. There's not always an app for that. And we've got to get back to a more humanistic, holistic view and a vantage point that says we are, in fact, all created equal, and we have to start working towards that. I am as frustrated as you are, not just with government, but with industry. I've spent nearly 50 years speaking to this, and I think it's rather sad, but I still have to be very Irish and be hopeful that we're still talking about this.
So, which leads into how do we build that accessible environment that's able to identify when that elevator's out? Cleo, I mean, you and I have had these conversations and what the real time of that actually looks like.
Right, I mean, there's no reason really other than it needs to be implemented that there's not some kind of sensor that tells somebody somewhere that this elevator's out and they can dispatch somebody to go fix it. Or that they can then let the train operators know that the elevator at X street is out and announce it and have the electronic sign on the train say it so everybody knows, okay, I can't get out at 42nd Street, I have to go to 59th Street or whatever the situation is. And I think it's about not doing what we've always done. People get in ruts. I eat the same sandwich every day for lunch. People get in ruts.
Peanut butter and jelly.
People who work in the different industries, people who work for the subway system, this is the way it's always been done. If I had $1 every time somebody said, well, this is the way we do it, I could retire tomorrow. But because they're not thinking new ways to do things, sometimes there are easy fixes if you just think outside the box that you've put yourself in.
Yeah, and I'll bring up a little bit of an example from the transportation world as well. You know, something that we've learned, and this goes across sectors, is, what do you do first? Let's say, for example, we're trying to make taxis accessible or make something accessible. There's the human element, which is the drivers who are driving the vehicles and helping the people with disabilities. And then there's the hardware element, right? The actual vehicles themselves. Now, if we launched a huge training campaign to train drivers on accessible service and how to use these vehicles before the vehicles were out there, how many drivers do you think would actually show up, engage, and how many would actually remember? So in some ways, we've spent years getting the hardware on the road. There are thousands, many thousands of taxis that have wheelchair accessible features and ramps and things like that. And we get tons of complaints. The number one complaint is, I got a driver who doesn't know what he's doing. You know what I mean? And
Give a fuck about people with disabilities. I had that happen.
well,
Can we watch with the language and just keep that down?
We gotta make this real because this is what
We could, but we can do it in a civil manner.
That's against the rules.
a civil manner is to allow people to be stuck in a situation where they're in danger. That's
They're not allowed. Drivers are not allowed to refuse. That's a supplementable offense.
allowed, but they do. What's the enforcement?
The enforcement is you call.
Be a civic I want to know what the protocol is.
If you call
And
311,
he will give you the protocol, sir.
you can dial 311, get the taxi medallion's number and the time that it happened. The TLC will issue a hearing. The driver will get summoned or get his license suspended, either $150 or get his license. You don't have to show up. You could write a letter of your statement. You have to say what happened. I don't if.
Hold this trial. There will be a fine, which totally cuts us out of
Yeah. So what I was saying before that was, we are working heavily now to add the humanistic element, the training. And it's like, it is not, it's difficult as a regulator, as a government agency, to sometimes do those at the same time, right? Demand is really coming into the taxi industry. People, wheelchairs are using it much more. Paratransit using it. Now, drivers see this as a money-making opportunity. Tons of trips. They're excited. They want to learn. They want to make sure they provide good service. They know people are giving tips. There was many years where they didn't believe that. So it's cultural change. But and again, with elevators, I don't work for the MTA, I can't speak for them, but you install the elevators, new problem arises. They're always broken, people get stuck. How do you deal with it? And sometimes, you know, it takes time to figure out the additional kind of steps that it takes to make something work from A to Z. And in government terms, things take years. I mean, it'll take us the next 5 to 10 years as the TLC to train drivers culturally and physically how to use the ramp and how to deal with people with disabilities. And that's just the nature of it, that sometimes, you know, what goes first?
So, Alex, that's a good point. And if we think about the accessibility of buses and how long it's actually taken us to get to where we are today, you're saying that this is going to take years. So Kira, let's talk about some of the issues that you see internationally for people with disabilities in design. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Can you repeat the question?
What do you see internationally in accessibility and design? Maybe in Denmark.
In terms of cities? And,
yeah, just city. I mean, you specifically spoke about some good design that happened because they built for the wheels because it's a very bike-centered culture.
Yep.
What obstacles do you happen to see internationally besides obstacles, not in good design, but obstacles? Have you?
I think each country and each city, we keep seeing the same things.
And what are those things?
I think those things are, in terms of, we're doing city bases, it could be bad roads, bad pavements, steps. Where do I find, as we talked about, the elevators and the lifts, and what happens if they don't work? How do we get around them? And transport. I know particularly my route to work every morning, and I thought about this, and it was a little bit on the break, we talked about it. If I were to wake up tomorrow and lose the ability to walk or my legs, I would actually have to change my route to work because my bus doesn't offer that ability to get on it.
So you're seeing some where buses aren't accessible, as opposed to here in New York City, every bus is accessible.
Yeah, so of course it would take a long time to get these buses that they have all access, but I think I've seen countless times where on my particular bus to work, where you've seen parents that come on with strollers. And the struggle that they have to do to get up these really narrow little tiny doors to get up and try and maneuver on. And I think it's the same issue when we talk about people with disabilities and if you're on crutches, if you've got a cane, if you're in a wheelchair, it's to look at the broader picture and to see people, and with all people, we all have different abilities and different needs, and it just so happens that this particular service doesn't offer this. And I guess that's the question is, so what happens if I did wake up tomorrow and didn't have my legs? What would I do? How do I get to work?
Thank you. So, Pat, you mentioned something a couple of minutes ago that you don't think everything can be solved by technology. I believe there's a lot that can be solved by technology. Kat, you want to kind of take this on a little bit?
What would you like me to take on?
The idea of about technology not being able to bridge the gap, or how technology can bridge the gap in a better way.
Well, Patty and I are probably in a very similar category in terms of how we think about the role of technology. I'd say that the enthusiasm for the potential, right? Technology is a tool. It is what we make it. It is put out in the world, and people use it in all the ways you never intended. And I think the real genius in some of the conversation here is design is as much about framing meaningful and good problems to solve as it is about the solutions to the problems that you framed. And so how does design frame problems that are pragmatic, meaningful, in the moment, and often the things that are small moments. And you think of how many industry-focused efforts are geared towards elaborate imagination of augmented realities where we can smell what it's like to be on Mars. And wouldn't that be fantastic? But my gosh, we spent $50 million trying to envision that experience. And at the same time, that $50 million could solve 50 million discrete meaningful, pragmatic, everyday problems to solve for people as they are navigating their way from point A to point B. And so when I think of the role of technology, I think so many things that we've invented are sitting on shelves like a pantry in a kitchen just collecting dust because they've been applied to these problems that no one has. And, and so I see again and again with inclusive design, when it's really about bringing in who is most excluded, what are the barriers that they encounter, the moment we start to frame problems from that vantage point, you go to the pantry and you see you have more than enough to work with. You have more than enough to create. It is a matter of matching it up to those solutions in the places where people are.
So talking about, and we touched on this earlier before, is those people, right? And how, I'm gonna come back to this again. How do we ensure that people with disabilities are included in the design process? Anyone want to take that one?
That's my quick response. It's not inclusive design if you don't.
Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, look, I'm just gonna be a company or an agency that wants to make something accessible. Now, specifically as a government agency, there's a specific challenge, right? And I'm gonna be open. I'm not gonna suggest that this is a solution, but you know, some government agencies, because of legal liability or other kinds of things, sometimes if you bring people with disabilities in and identify a problem, you've opened up a lawsuit. But that by no means, in any way, shape, or form, should suggest that you should not engage with the disability community for their feedback. And I think more and more, I mean, within this city, but certainly other cities, you know, are, at least within other cities, it's becoming the norm. If we're going to build something, we're going to bring in a group of people with disabilities. We're going to tell them what we're thinking. We're going to identify, we're going to state what our problems are and get their feedback and try to include it in the design. And I hear more and more of that happening in terms of what companies or agencies are thinking of. Not just because they think they're going to get sued, but because it's the right thing to do. There are challenges all over the place in terms of making that happen. But I think whether you're hiring people with disabilities, whether you're bringing in, you have a committee that's helping to consult on what you're working on, the key is to include the community. No matter what you say or how you frame it, it is very difficult for somebody who's never lived this, that has difficulty relating, to learn this in a book or learn this in school. And it ultimately does come from the community to give the proper feedback to how things should be designed, governed, or built.
So, you know, Elise.
Also, though, I'll say that it's really important to bring people with disabilities into the, that's a deafism. When you don't hear or you're not reinforced for 20 some odd years, you tend to jumble things up. Anyways, people with disabilities need to be brought in at the beginning of the process. When we don't do that, not only do we have worse designs, but it also ends up costing us an incremental amount more. So.
I agree, and we often do a lot of different things within the city to engage communities. I know Chris Noel, who works in the Parks Department, is there to ensure that he has a committee together when they're building new park features, that people with disabilities have an opportunity to weigh in. Alex did that when he was talking about Taxi and Limousine Commission to do that. But when is it the responsibility of the person with a disability, or is it not?
Where's the responsibility to not have us give our knowledge, et cetera?
Well, no, wait.
Come back to the question of which said pay us. I am so sick and tired of being tapped as an expert.
I'm getting, Edith, I'm getting there. So if I can just encourage everybody to wait until we open up for questions and answers, I'm more than happy to get there. So please, that means everyone. Yeah. And Edith, I agree with you, and this is the reason what I'm getting at.
We have 40 minutes for Q&A in about 10 minutes, so you guys will get there.
So let's talk about that, right? Is it the responsibility of the person with a disability? And we often pull people with disabilities into the conversation because we have to, and we should. But is it right for them to give their knowledge for free? Someone. Yeah, Tim. Go ahead.
Any expertise requires compensation. I think in the moment that we recognize that expertise is a necessary contribution to a design is the moment that it is required to be compensated at the level of any expertise that is contributed to a design. I think that there is a real challenge in checking off a list saying that you have done participatory design by seeking input, but not having mechanisms to incorporate that into the solution. And also it is important to have that loop and that cycle back once that feedback's been provided for people to see how it influenced the process. I think transparency is one thing that design, especially in technology, has been lacking. There's a bit of a professional expertise superseding the lived expertise. And as we start to increase the value, the role, and the compensation of people's lived experience as a contribution to design, it also needs to come with a degree of transparency on how that contribution impacts the decision making.
Yeah, Luke, go ahead. It's all yours.
No, I completely valid. Just to amplify that, the mantra is always, like technological innovation should never happen at the expense of stakeholder equity, right? So like if you can figure out a way, so the community should not work for free. No community should work for free. It's a responsibility of the designer to front load an inclusive understanding of who this is going to impact in any way. This is why like things like artificial intelligence are really problematic in so many ways. It's not that, and there's a real opportunity for real good coalition politics around this, because it's not just ableist, it's also racist, it's also sexist, it's also right we're feeding computers with data, and the people feeding the data are themselves a non-diverse set of people who have bias, right? So the computer's just doing what it's told, but it's being told the wrong stuff at the beginning. And so the faster you can get to a situation where design professionals are really have that checklist at the first day and know that if I'm gonna be making something, I need to know everybody I need to bring into the conversation, and I need to have the resources to bring them into the conversation. I think it's in fairness, I think the best way to do these things is to just be open. That's why.
So resources, right? Resources are money, and money needs to be allocated appropriately is what you're saying, Luke, to ensure that people with disabilities are getting paid for their design.
Paid or voiced or credited or amplified or whatever that is. Right?
Alex?
Whatever that is.
Yeah, I'm going to give a more controversial answer. I definitely think people with disabilities should get paid if they're going to, this is what they choose to do. But it's not really that simple. I mean, in the sense that it's really a problem within the community. For some people, consulting or advising or advocating for accessibility is a passion project. I know I can see people in this room who have full-time jobs that have nothing to do with accessibility, and yet they advocate for accessibility, they go to things, they consult on it, and they do it because it's a passion project. When I was working for an attorney as a few years, I did nothing in the field of accessibility and disability. I was a patent attorney. But I worked, I advocated, I consulted, I did it because it was a passion project. You know what I mean? And I look at this kind of like the world of art or performers. They have similar issues, right? There are performers that will perform for less than others. I mean, it really depends what field you're in. And they look at others, hey, why are you doing this for free? Hey, why are you lowering the bar? It's really for us as a community to create a structure, a business structure. There's organizations like United Spinal that has an architectural accessibility consulting wing. And they've been successful in terms of consulting and charging lots of money to big companies. And if it's something you don't want to do for free and you're an expert, you should say that. I'm not doing this for free. But it's not as simple as you're saying we should. There are all kinds of market dynamics and people characteristics and personalities that lead to how this works. I wish that the industries that needed us would set the standard themselves and say, you're going to get paid. You know what I mean? So there wouldn't be that side of it. And that's really where it needs to get to, right? The majority of industries, that consulting is a thing and consultants get paid. But I think because we're still in the infancy of the accessibility movement, especially as it becomes accepted, we're not there yet.
So,
Just justify not paying people with disabilities. I'll shut up. I'm gonna take one half.
so we were talking, Eloise, you mentioned something about accessible Ollie. Ollie, O-L-L-I-E.
What's your question?
So it's a great piece of autonomous vehicle that's out there. So that was built with people with disabilities in mind. Do you know everything that's happening with Accessible Ollie?
Not everything, no. What else would you?
No, can you talk, so let me explain what Accessible Ollie is. It is an autonomous vehicle, and this autonomous vehicle will allow for a person with a disability to fully ride that. And when I'm talking about a person with a disability, it runs the gamut. Eloise talked about hearing aids that are in there, so captioning, hearing loops that are built into this Accessible Ollie. They have a ramp system that pre-detects if a person with a disability is going to ride and pre-arranges the seats prior to a person coming on. So there isn't any of that confusion. And when they get onto an Accessible Ollie, they have a vice grip that actually bridges the gap between the wheels, so they don't need a person to physically do that. They also have an avatar in there, so a person can sign. Someone who is deaf can sign with this avatar to get the information that they need. They have cognitive buttons, so people with people with cognitive disabilities can use those buttons for simple gestures. So when they were thinking about accessibility, the Accessible Ollie really brings that into a place that we've never seen before. So I want to thank you, Eloise, for kind of mentioning that, because it is a great piece of technology that is going to be a game changer for people with disabilities as autonomous vehicles come into the space. Because people with visual disabilities would love vehicles like this. And I was at the Ruderman Foundation a couple of months ago, and we were I was moderating a panel on transportation, and the Accessible Ollie person was there, and a person with a visual disability raised their hand and said, "I want to be the guinea pig. I don't care if I die." That's how we laugh, right? And we think about the dangerous part of that, but that's how important accessible transportation is to someone with a visual disability. I see Annie Lease back there from Cultural Affairs that's actually talking about that. That it really makes a difference in being able to provide that type of transportation. And as cities become more smart, how does that really encompass people with various disabilities? People with visual disabilities that are crossing the street, people with cognitive disabilities to navigate the street that comes on there. How does a person who is deaf communicate with our accessible kiosks that are on the street, like Link NYC? How do we use our street grid to effectively add raise crosswalks so there's no ponding, we don't have to worry about shoveling? How do we build environments that are accessible for people with disabilities? These are all the things that accessible smart cities will bring us, and accessible design will put us into the future. I am banking and hoping that we have a technology that comes in there and to be a more inclusive city. I think we're running out of time before we get to questions, but if everybody on the panel can just give a little bit, just a quick synopsis of what they think accessible cities and how they should be designed. And before we open it up for questions, I'd like to hear that. Akira, can we go with you first?
I think it's a great point where you mentioned, just want to bring it up because it popped into my head when you talked about crossing roads. So this is my first time in New York, and crossing a road, here you have the light and the countdown, right? So when the countdown was coming on, and I was standing, waiting, and then these people were crossing, and I'm going, what are they doing? Like, you can't cross. Because in Denmark, we have the opposite system. So when the countdown is coming, it's the countdown to when you can cross. So, and it just confused the hell out of me. And I just think when we're talking about accessible sort of in inclusive cities, and when we're talking about visitors coming over, and it's a bigger picture, and it's the world, you know, and it's visual cues, but I didn't understand that because I was used to seeing something else and understanding that. So I think it's really important that when we are talking about designing accessible, inclusive cities, that there is a bigger picture to think about, and thinking about people who aren't from not just one city, but from the country, and how different countries and have different cultures, and they react to different things in different ways. And I think it's so important when we communicate that to people, that these visuals or sounds or experiences are clearly communicated.
Thank you. Kat?
I think so. Inclusion means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And in writing a book recently on the topic, I was asked to write a book on inclusion. I realized I actually just didn't know what that word meant anymore. And looking it up, the Latin root claudere is to shut, and inclusion is shutting in. And that kind of blew my mind for a moment, that, you know, there can be so many different interpretations. It's evolved over time. On the other hand, like conversely, exclusion is universally understood. It is when you are left out. It is when you cannot access. And so I ended up writing about exclusion as opposed to inclusion as a way to approach the topic. I think when it comes to the design of cities, all that we can really do is recognize one point of exclusion after another and ask ourselves, what is this space really meant to be great at? And how many different ways can people participate in that experience? Because a city is the convergence of opportunity, of economic growth, of personal growth, and the ways that people want to get there, our cities have to flex and adapt to those individual needs. Whether that's through technology, through the ways that we recognize our interdependence with each other, or if you know, it's about removing some legacies and building new in their place. So when I think about an accessible city, I think about the human beings in that city, asking who is this accessible to? What does that mean? And having that conversation on an ongoing basis in pursuit of finding and remedying those exclusions.
So we got Kira talking about making sure that there's parity across the world. You're talking about flexibility and adaptation. So Eloise, you're up.
Being a non-New Yorker, I would have to say the subway system, making it more intuitive. It's hard for me. I can't just ask someone what, you know, whether I'm going the right way. So that's really hard. The other day, I was trying to get to the east side, and the train's options were downtown or uptown. So
No crosstown.
I went one way.
Got it. Alex.
You're not going to say anything?
No, I'm the moderator.
Here, you get out of this one. I mean, I think while we're on our way to, you know, real inclusiveness across the board in our societies and real universal design, inclusive design, a lot of industries still don't choose to be accessible on their own, and it is the job of government to kind of nudge them strongly, regulatorily, to do so, because it's the right thing to do and because it's the right thing for our future. And I really think that for our present and our future. And I really think government has come a long way, specifically here in New York. Just that we're having panels like this and events like this, and there are people like myself who are hired in positions like mine, and that lawsuits have been coming out in favor of people with disabilities for quite some time, means that the needle has moved forward. There is still a lot to be done. There is still a lot more complex conversations to be had in terms of money, the human element, the capital element, the infrastructure element. But I say keep the conversation going. And I think just the fact that it's not okay to say that somebody can no longer access something or hear something or, you know, be present at something, that's no longer an acceptable answer, is already a step in the right direction.
Thank you. Pat?
I'm sitting here in some sort of time warp. At some points, I felt like I was back in the late 60s and early 70s when we would be meeting on these same topics and the conversation's exactly the same. And then someone reflects on autonomous vehicles, and I realize now we're actually in 2018.
Well, that's a good thing, right?
Yeah, well, that said, I think a big problem has been the legislation of creativity. When someone proudly tells me that their design meets the ADA, I say, whoop-de-doo, you got a D, because that's just a passing grade. When we were writing the ADA and sitting in Washington with the Transportation Board, and I was listening to people just screaming and pitching fits, it was hardly a good time, but we knew we had to do something because of the long-time failures to embrace design as the solution. I don't think governance is ever going to be the solution. I think it's all about creativity and people. We no longer design for people, nor should we ever. We're supposedly designing with people, and that's essential. My hope remains that at some point we'll recognize that what isn't working has to be flipped on its side, and we have to start looking at what can work. And if we're not all working together, if everyone isn't at the table, then we're going to continue having, unfortunately, these misfits and these very dismissive attitudes. And then I'm reminded of being on stage with Ed Koch as his security guy came and whispered in his ear, "Your Honor, there's been another death threat." And when I heard that, I just stepped back 2 steps because, I didn't want to be in the line of fire. But I loved Ed. Ed loved this city, and I know he probably wasn't everybody's cup of tea. But I always looked to Ed and his passion and his recognition that government can't do this alone. And it really is by the people, not for the people.
Thank you. Luke?
You're like a tough act to follow. Yeah.
And she knows that.
You know, I don't really have an answer. I'm excited by the stuff on the walls in this room. I'm excited that the stuff on the walls of this room is in this specific room because this is the National Design Museum of the United States. This isn't like a classroom at NYU where we're just doing this for fun. I think that's really validating. I think the best thing that could ever happen is for me to go out of business. Like, for you to go out of business. Like, I would love us to go out of business, right? Like,
I agree.
We could go to Hawaii. We could open up a bar. I don't know. We could do whatever. Like, I would love us to go out of business. It's going to take a minute because progress. We talked about this after the screening I was here on Tuesday night. Progress is asymptotic, right? It's like Zeno's paradox. You always get halfway to equality, and then you get halfway to equality, and you get halfway, and you never quite get there, and so you always have to push as hard as you can. But I think some good things are happening, and I think I'm excited that there can just be a really good open conversation about what it means to have stakeholder inclusive design. I think that's I think that maybe those conversations I'm sure were happening in some quarters in 1966, but like they weren't happening necessarily here. And I think that's good. So
Thank you, Luke. Cleo?
I'm with Luke in Hawaii. I make a mean rum punch.
yeah, no, you got it.
I think that the main thing is to keep the conversation going, getting the people who aren't in this room, who should be in this room, into this room, and that's a really tough, that's probably our toughest challenge. Voices are heard, and I think people need to keep using their voices.
Well, I want to thank the panel here for everything they've done. So let's give them a round of applause before we give them a hard time, because now it's your turn to ask questions, and I am pretty sure it's going to be a nice conversation. Please.
So we have runners who, on both sides of the room, who will get to you. We see your hands.
And if you can, say your name before you ask the question so we know who you are.
You're going to call people, though?
Yep, we'll start over here.
At the beginning, the High Line was mentioned, something in the design brief about make it accessible. Part of why it came as close as it did to being accessible, which is not 100% by any means, is that they had at least one general public input meeting at which a couple of disability activists, myself and Margie Rubin, showed up at in the architect's studio. And I noticed that they had this extremely peculiar perimeter on the pavement. It's not just like a plain sidewalk. This is some sort of aesthetic trickiness or something. But it's the weirdest, most unpredictable perimeter that they have that's all serrated and jogs around. And I said, you know, if a person's wayfinding with a cane, they'll be over the edge and into the mud. And that's why it has a raised edge, because even if they didn't specifically invite people with disabilities, we heard about it, and I talked the architect into it in front of 50 people, and there was also perhaps a little social pressure among 50 people for the guy to say yes. The reason why some of the High Line benches have armrests, which help certain people sit down and stand up, is because Margie Rubin of Disabled in Action pointed out the need and talked them into it. Now, both of these examples of public input, and also the fact that the serrated part, it's like sort of like an upside down fork laying on a table. If you flip a fork over, you have that little hump before the tines. That was also something I talked them into. The official story of the High Line doesn't mention any public input at all. It's just the architects were all geniuses and perfect. But still, you know, universal design is viewed as a niche. It is not viewed as something that should percolate through general design thinking. So when you go up in the elevator on 17th Street, you exit and you're heading west toward the river. You go around 10 or 12 feet, and then there's a bunch of bushes and shrubs in the dirt. You would have to know about this and walk around it in order to get to the main sort of boulevard of the sidewalk that you're headed towards. Now, that's a very peculiar kind of a navigation thing to expect people to do. If universal design had sort of percolated into their general thinking, they would have just let people have a direct shot toward the avenue. Instead, there's one more peculiar thing you have to know. I should have mentioned, the armrests in the end did not work out well because they're heavy stainless steel. In the summer sun, they become so hot that you cannot touch them. So that should have been, you know, probably some kind of wood. Within a few years, at the northern boundary, before they made it even longer, they put a bench which looked like a balance beam. It was about 6 inches wide. Nobody could possibly sit on that without pain. Where they get the idea that's a bench, I don't know. You know, the chaise lounges are down in a pit. They have a couple of little amphitheater things which were very cramped, and they didn't want to redesign those to be fully accessible. But they did get some, you know, sometimes if you have a general public input meeting, people with disabilities will show up and might actually be the only people in the audience that give you practical things that the designer can actually use. But for example, in the World Trade Center, the architects were supposed to show up for a public input meeting at John Jay College, and the thing runs for 3 hours. The architect leaves after an hour and a half and doesn't even hear what most of the public comments were, because nobody's checking up on him. And, you know, on paper it looked like he was there, but no, not really. But sometimes, you know, we actually give more of a contribution that can be used than some of the more general opinions in the room at a general public input meeting. This is also how we had some influence on the design for the expansion of Penn Station. But then when the glossy histories and hagiographies are published, somehow that gets deleted from what the story is, and it all turns into these architects were perfect.
Yeah, having your input, having people sit on their community boards and being involved in that community board process certainly helps move things along. So thank you for that. Question right here. Oh yeah, that's fine. Yes.
Sorry, I want to know, I have done a lot of research interviewing older people, and all the things that are true about ADA are going to be 10 times truer when people like me in 20 years are still expecting to walk up and down the subway steps. And I'm curious about the new subways, new subway cars, how much input, formal input, to that gentleman's point, formal input is made when you make a major change to a critical piece of mass transportation that everyone has to use?
Great question. We know, I'll tell you what we do know. We, the city of New York, do not have the ability, we aren't involved as much as we should be. We do have a couple of board positions that are there. We have our commissioner of Department of Transportation, Polly Trottenberg, who is a fierce advocate for people with disability and continues to advocate for people with disabilities on every way, shape, and form along the way. So we have a voice there, but not a big enough voice. I believe, and if you read Accessible NYC, that's our State of Persons with Disabilities in New York City, it's on our website, that I believe that we should have a person with a disability that is appointed to that board, because we really need to make sure that the things that they're putting forward is accessible. To that, we, the Mayor's Office for Persons with Disabilities, continue to work with the MTA on every issue. As a matter of fact, in the next few weeks, I'll be meeting with the new head of MTA to be able to talk about accessibility. And if you hear him, he is making a good point that accessibility is one of his pillars of his vision of the future of the MTA. I know that there isn't enough work done, and we're going to be pushing the MTA in that to get people with disabilities involved in that process, and I think it's very frustrating, and I know Edith Prentice could certainly talk to that more. I encourage you to talk to her a little bit after we're done, because Edith is a darling when it comes to accessibility on the subway station. I'm just going to give you a little bit of my experience about the subway system. I decided I was going to try it one day, and I said, I'm doing it. So I found my way to an accessible subway stop. I got on, and I had a transfer at 42nd Street. And I get up this elevator, and I'm on the elevator for like 10 minutes, and I run into Edith. And I go, Edith, I'm lost. Which way do I go? And of course, Edith was there to be able to tell me that. But now not everyone's going to find an Edith which way to go. So there has to be a lot of improvement that's made in the MTA. Our office is committed to doing that, and we're going to be pushing the MTA more on that. As far as the subway cars go, I haven't really seen them, so I really can't speak to that. What's that? I didn't specifically. Right.
But it's important to know they don't pull out the buses when we bitch enough. And we've seen buses before they were purchased, when there were buses in process. So we have seen some of these things. There have been awful buses that we thought we would love. For example, the bus that had the 3 wheelchair spots. Yay! An extra wheelchair in each bus. Until we actually did it and discovered there wasn't enough space. You couldn't get through. I'm sorry. The person in the back, it was like playing bumper cars. So we also have stupid ideas.
And we certainly need to be able to get people with disabilities more involved in that process, and we're kind of we are committed to do that. So let's get a question. Let's go. This lady, 2 ladies right here in the front. Thank you, Edith.
And he was just in the wrong elevator. He was in the right place, but in the wrong direction.
Hi, my name is Arlene Romoff, and I'm a consultant and advocate for people with hearing loss. I'm deaf. I'm a late deafened adult, lost my hearing as an adult, and I use 2 cochlear implants and have authored 2 books on the subject. I've been involved in advocacy for people with hearing loss for 30 years or so, and been around. What impressed me was Victor's response to Elise talking about InnoCaption, that he didn't know about it, and that he thanked her for informing him about it. My issue with that is that people with hearing loss are pretty much invisible. We're thought of as our disability isn't a real disability. It doesn't inconvenience or it doesn't look like it does. But as InnoCaption shows, and your response shows, how many people in your division have a hearing loss? How many people anywhere who are hired have a hearing loss? And in my 30 years experience, the answer is pretty much 0 or 1 or 2 in 30 years. These people, we do not get the jobs, not in Access or anywhere else. I'm a past president and founder of the Hearing Loss Association of New Jersey, which is a national that has a chapter in New York City as well. I'm involved in that as well. And I know firsthand, we get inquiries from people in the job sector, should they reveal that they have a hearing loss. If they do, they won't get the interview. They won't get the job. If they're already on the job and start losing hearing, should they reveal that they're losing the hearing? No, they won't get promoted. They'll lose their job no matter what, if it's illegal or not. There are always reasons. So my point is that people with hearing loss are not represented in this disability community in places where they're paid for their work. They're paid for their expertise. So I'd like to tell you, InnoCaption works, and there are other apps on the phone that can give you caption phone service. But the reason it works is because there's somebody like the woman behind the curtain back there who is doing real-time captioning. It keeps up. And not only does it keep up, it's the only app that will keep up in a teleconference call. So that's a business function. Now, New York City does not have relay conference captioning, which is available in New Jersey for free. I can call and get free captioning for teleconference calls, not available in this city. Okay, but for purposes of design, I would like to leave you with one big point, and that word is acoustics. Nobody talks about acoustics. Well, I'm the canary in the mine that these devices do not work well where there is an echo. They don't function like a human ear. So this room, for example, does not have an acoustic tile ceiling, has no captioning, is all hard surfaces, and I'm telling you that without the captioning, I can't close my eyes. If this were acoustically excellent, I could hear every word, and I do not.
It certainly is a thing to think about for accessible design and make sure that we plan and implement that way. I think the lady behind you had a question. Thank you, Arlene. Oh, right behind her? No, right.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And then lady to your left.
I have two statements. The first one is that I had a lot of breakage, so I had to go along the New York Transportation Services with canes and crutches and other things. And the one thing I learned is that there's no notification if an escalator is not working. And I happened to be working at Bloomingdale's, and I had to be working at MoMA, and they have two very large, long subway escalators, 53rd Street and 59th Street. And there's never any notification when you get out of the subway, when you're in the subway, that those escalators are not working. And nor is there any notification when you're approaching the subway that those escalators are not working. What I am saying is that we're all talking about tech, but there's simple things like words. The person in the conductor saying the escalator is not working, or when you are approaching it, that there's a sign that says the escalator is not working in front of the subway. I've seen too many people who have more issues than I have stumbling and getting up a hump. I think it's about almost 100 subway stairs, struggling to get up with crutches, canes, and disabilities of certain sorts because they can't get up or get down. The second thing is that is a kind of, will also state this, is that I have a friend who you know, Beth, who we were on the subway together, and if we had known that the elevator was not working at the subway stop that we got off of, it would have been a lot easier. But we got off the elevator was not working. And through the kindness of two very, very special men, they turned around to her and said, "I will help you." One man took her chair, her wheelchair, and the other man took her in his arms, and they carried her up to the street with me. And if we had not had that help, I don't know what we would have done. We would have to go back to our original stop and figure out a way of getting upstairs. And that's what I'm saying, is that we're all talking about tech, we're talking about apps. What about some visuals, and what about things that you can hear?
No, absolutely agree. I've been in that situation a lot myself. Totally understand what the system is like. Changing ways that we do things are something that we're certainly going to be talking to the MTA. I wish I had the answer for this, and I could tell you I don't. Do we have ideas about how to make that that work? So automatically the elevator's down, which therefore pipes the information directly to the conductor to make that information both audible and readable within the train station. Yes, that's something that we would love to see happen. There are a lot of different ways to bridge this gap, but again, we're dealing with an old 1900s infrastructure, and how do we be able to do the thing to make those things accessible? Alex?
Yeah, I was going to add one.
One thing I learned when I've been in this situation is that one thing that I've said to people when I'm in this situation and I'm talking to the person that I'm trying to convince, I say to them, "What if that was your mother? What if that
Totally
was your father?"
agree with you.
And you know what? It's very interesting that I get a much better response, because all of a sudden they're thinking about somebody in their own family who would not be able to function in this particular situation.
I agree.
Yeah, I was just going to say, quick to a bit of information. The MTA is having a public forum on a new app that they're coming out with on March 1st. It's rare that MTA has such forums, but they are having one. If you're interested, you can get more information. It's specifically an app for paratransit, but at the same time, it'll give the public a chance to engage with the MTA on accessibility.
I would encourage each and every one of you to go to the board meetings of the MTA and voice your concerns there as well. Annie in the back.
Hi, my name is Annie Least. I am an artist. I also now work for the city, for the Department of Cultural Affairs, in a new position that is specifically has been specifically created to focus on accessibility and inclusion of people with disabilities in the arts and the culture of the city of New York, which is a pretty amazing thing. And that's sort of where I also have a visual impairment, by the way. And also, I would love to be an accessible Ollie guinea pig right there. Now that I know that's a thing. Anyway, so my question is kind of about quality of life and quality of experience. We've talked a lot about getting from point A to point B. We've talked a lot about being able to get into buildings and out of them and to be where you need to be. And that is all incredibly, tremendously, 100% important and needs to be dramatically improved in this city. We can do better with that. But in addition, I want to talk to all of the designers in the room who are interested in making interesting things or beautiful things, not just functional things. I think it's really important when you're designing something not to make it like the bright yellow, incredibly conspicuous, hideous tape recorder I was given when I was from the Library of Congress to listen to my books on tape. Wonderful service, really hideous tape recorder, right? and as somebody who is an artist as well as a person with vision loss, I always wondered, do they think we don't care? Of course we care. Everybody cares how the experience, and not just about how things look, but how they feel, how easy they are to use. And so that's my challenge to the design community, and my question for the panel is a step further. A huge portion of living in this city involves engaging actively in the community, in all the cultural offerings the city has, in all the nightlife, in all the entertainment, in all the museums, in wonderful forums and discussions and lectures like this. And I'm wondering if any of you guys have any thoughts about that aspect of accessibility and inclusion in terms of the accessible city, beyond just getting from point A to point B, but making that experience awesome and making what you're getting to at point B worth going to.
Anyone want to take that?
I can speak a little bit to some of the stuff we've done cultural organizations especially, have have a you know, a responsibility in this space to you know, try to again figuring out, you know, who the space is for. It's for everybody. So how do we get there? There are best practices that can be, you know, adopted, thought up, whatever. I think we did a decent job with your joint, Pam, when we were hanging out. I think, you know, it's, but again, it's asymptotic, right? Like, it's like everything we improve, there's other things that need to be improved. I'd be happy to talk to you more about this, but like, you know, that, and when I think of accessible city, like when I think of that label, that's actually the first thing I think of, the whole, like, you know, I want to go dancing, right? Or I want to go to a club, or I want to go to a really good restaurant and not have the reflected walls that makes it impossible to have a conversation, right? Or whatever, like that. That's the kind of stuff, because that's why we're here, right? We're not actually New Yorkers because we like the subway. We're New Yorkers because we like where the subway takes us, right? So that, right? Does that make sense? So that's like that's my riff on that. Yeah.
And, Tom Finkelpearl, got a question. Yeah, please, hop in on this, Tom.
So
I use your help up here. If you can see, I'm sweating.
Annie is one of my staff members. I just want to say one thing, which has to do with sort of intersectionality, which is right now the Department of Cultural Affairs is requiring all members of the cultural institution group, which is about half of the cultural life of New York City. So it's the Met, Natural History, Lincoln Center, BAM, Brooklyn Museum, Queens Museum, et cetera, where we're the landlord. All those institutions are being required to develop a diversity, equity, and inclusion plan by next year, or there will be funding consequences if they don't. So the question here is how the people in this room, who all care about disability access and inclusion, can be allies with the folks who are interested in gender issues, race issues, because diversity, equity, and inclusion always reverts in people's minds, not always in this room, but to race. So there's a lot of stuff where I feel like there's no substitute to having diverse staff if you want diverse audience and diverse programming, and that needs to include disability. So I just wanted to say that more people with disabilities on staff, so cultural institutions are going to solve a lot of problems. They have to be in positions of power and responsibility. Anyway, I just want to throw that in.
Yeah.
Tom,
thanks.
We love you.
Okay. Hi, I'd like to jump in at that point because I think to what Cleo was saying earlier, you know, we are the choir. Everybody here is on the same team. So we also have to be aware that we're here to support each other. But then also, my question is, how do we welcome the rest? Those that are, you know, maybe unaware of what's happening, but would be willing, or if they knew more. And I've been thinking not only about technology, I mean, Luke can tell you that I'm all for human-centered, you know, design and working with people, but I also think that it's really about cultural awareness and acceptance and training. So for example, I don't do the subway at all, mostly because I can do the stairs with help, but when I get onto that subway platform, I am almost mauled to death every single time. And so for me to risk my life to take something that might be slightly faster once I get down the stairs after half hour, doesn't really make sense. So I don't, you know what I mean? So even if there were accessible elevators at every corner, you know, I think the fact that, you know, there might not be as much awareness in the subway system as there is for the bus, for example, where people know there's a section that, you know, is accessible and people sit there. I still get dirty looks sometimes from people on the bus too, because, you know, I'm not in a wheelchair, so people, and when I'm sitting down, people don't necessarily know that I have a need. But I think there's a lot of possibility, and I want us, if it's possible for us to think about what can be done and how we can, you know, include more in the conversation, more people who would be willing, or how can we culturally, you know, inspire a shift together? because we are all in this together. And I'm just really thankful for everyone in this room and everything you are doing. We're all on the same team from different points of the field. So I look forward to hearing more about, if you have anything on the panel to say about ways in which we can engage others and include them in the conversation so that it's not just the choir. The fact that I, know half the people in this room is wonderful, but I'd love to see people, that I don't know having these conversations.
I think that Kat really started off the conversation really well before when she said people with disabilities need to be employed, right? If we're not in the workplace, if we're not in the cultural institutions, if we're not senators and council members, if we're not working for city government, if we're not there, we are not heard. Advocates make a lot of noise, and advocates get a lot of things done. I hear Edith every day, and I can hear her right now yelling at me. But the reality is, without her voice, nothing gets done. And if people with disabilities aren't in the workplace, that's an issue. We have an initiative called NYC at Work, is to employ people with disabilities throughout the city in every job sector on the job of their choice, in diversity, in inclusion, to finance, to cultural institution, and the list goes on. I encourage you to look at it. NYC at Work, it's called. If you know people that are interested in being involved, contact us. Be more than happy to do that. But Kat nailed it. We need to be employed. One last question, and it's that lady right in front. You are the winner.
Thank you. So my question is to the consultants in design. So I'm also in design, and I know when you're having the conversations about early on about being more inclusive, that ego comes up a lot, and it's a lot of like, not in my design, that's not cool, that's not hip, that's not trendy. I'd like to know, like, before you guys went into consulting, how did each of you change hearts and minds in those conversations when people were like, not in my design, that's not hip? Like, how did you get them to think, like, well, it's not accessible either, like, no one but you and your friends can use it?
Every and any mechanism and method at my disposal. So I actually, when I left Microsoft, I thought I was going to jump out there and be doing design work right away. I was ready for that. And what I found is the work to do is to have conversation and to make introduction. And the reason that I've found that, is because there is a lot of fear around how to enter the conversation, a lot of fear about saying the wrong thing. For someone who's not engaged in a community conversation, it can be intimidating. It can be accessibility, Section 508, like trying to make sense of that can be intimidating. So finding the underlying fear that is really preventing somebody from stepping in and then addressing that has been one sharp point that I've used. It literally comes down to there is no language for how we talk about the hard aspects and then also the tools and the methods of making progress. There really is a lack of methods for how to introduce human diversity into the design process. We have tons of tools about simplifying it away to make sure that, personas and whatnot. So I've found that it is entirely about hitting the motivation, and I'm starting to find these buckets of motivation that are themes. Sometimes it's the innovation and economic perspective that, I didn't realize that half of the devices in this room or half of the objects I encounter every day actually started as a design for addressing a mismatch between a person with a disability and the world around them. I didn't know that. Oh, that could be applied as an innovation technique to my own business. For some people, it is truly the accessibility and the risk of retrofitting and the high cost of that. So I'd love to share anybody who's seeing these places where that kind of cultural shift, those entry points and those starting points, because I think they're going to bucket and we're going to get some really good techniques for breaking the, I'll say break the water, that's not what I meant, but breaking the ice, I don't know, to really get that conversation going across a lot of facets of exclusion.
Anyone else? Cleo?
Before I came to the city, I worked in a nonprofit, and we did some consulting with architect firms when they were doing renovation and construction. And I tried to explain why the thing needed to be accessible or why you needed to add the assistive listening device in the design from a human standpoint. One example was one day, designer was complaining they had designed this really fancy looking bar. It always comes back to bars. And he didn't want to put the lower section that's required by the code. And I explained to him if individual used a wheelchair or was a little person, that, you know, in order to actually function and use the bar and sit at the bar and eat or drink. And I could kind of see the light bulb go on above his head, because now he understood why that lower portion of the bar was there and why we didn't always want it off to the side, so then it just became the service section of the bar as opposed to for the patrons who are coming to the bar spending their money. And, you know, I kind of felt like he got it, and maybe going forward he would think about that in other aspects of things he was designing.
All right, well, I want to thank everybody in this room, or the audience. So thank you for being here, and thank you for Cooper Hewitt for putting this on.
And thank you, Victor, for your fantastic job running the room and leading the panel. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming.